our community in Columbia, people may think that the whole community is high opulent community, but within that, the segregation says there are pieces that that's not the case.
I have to tell you, I've never been to Missouri. My sister lived in St. Louis for 5 or 6 years, and then their jobs.
Just want to make sure it's on for you.
Oh, okay. And then their jobs had to move other places. So I've never seen anything here. You know, people ask me, the first time Columbia, first time to Missouri. And I was just in South Carolina, in Greenville, South Carolina, earlier this week, doing some missing middle housing work there for the city and the county. And I tell my wife every night I call her, I said, man, you know, there's just something about these states that I haven't been to very often. I've been to South Carolina a few times now, but even Missouri, it's just very obvious, the warmth that I feel, the people look you in the face. It sounds like, well, don't people look you in the face in California? Not as much as here, and not as much as in South Carolina. And that might seem like something maybe not big to you, but let me give you another example. I was in Oklahoma City on work about 4 years ago, and downtown Oklahoma City, big buildings, you know, you wouldn't expect people to know each other unless, you know, you happen to run into somebody that you know. And I'm walking from the hotel going down to City Hall to a meeting, and somebody that doesn't know me on a big, wide, 20-foot wide sidewalk could have walked right past me, looked across the sidewalk at me, walking by, and said, "How you doing?" And I went, "Wow, wow." And we don't have that in California as much anymore. I grew up in a really small town, so I guess I really expect that. And so when I come to states like this in South Carolina and Iowa, we're doing work in Iowa, I feel it. I can see it. So really, I applaud you for it. Maybe you don't even know that you're doing it. It's just the way you live. But it stands out to me. So I want to talk to you tonight about, I've been asked to talk to you about missing middle housing. I'm not a finance person. I'm not an expert in banking. I'm not an expert in the stock market. Believe me. I'm not an expert in tax credits. I'm an expert in missing middle housing, city planning, and zoning codes. And so that's what I want to talk to you about tonight, and our observations and our work over the past 10 years. That bio's a little old. I've actually got 32 years of experience and 20 of it doing this. So we've learned a lot about what's happening across the country. And so just to introduce this, well, first of all, how many of you heard about missing middle housing before you even heard about this event? Wow. Okay, so that points to what we found is the term missing middle housing, if you don't know, was coined by the founder of our firm, Dan Perolik. He's an architect, and he said one day about, I don't know, I'd say 10, 12 years ago at least, and he said, man, you know, every time we go to these older cities that have pre-World War II neighborhoods in them, they all have this. And he kept noticing, and he says, and you know, we've been building single-family houses, attached townhouses, and big apartments, but this other stuff that used to get built doesn't get built anymore. I wonder why that is. And that's how he coined the term missing middle. And I'll talk about that a little more. But that's what we're talking about. So before I get into what it is and all of that and all the details, I want to talk about why it's important in the first place. Basically, the reason it's important is that walkable cities or in walkable areas of cities are thriving again. Downtowns are the obvious places, right? But that's not all that's walkable. And I'll talk about that in a second. The demand for these kinds of environments beyond just downtown. Downtowns are the obvious ones that people say, oh yeah, I want to go walk down in downtown on the main street. You know, office tenants are saying it. People that want to live in these walkable neighborhoods are saying it, and millennials and boomers. So this is what most people think of when you say walkable, right? How many of you think well, raise your hands if you think this is one of the main ways that people think it's walkable. Yeah, okay, you're nodding your heads. Yeah, exactly. And so when we didn't realize this disconnect until we did a lot of these presentations, and we'd walk away and people would say, well, I don't want another downtown. We already have one. Are you saying to put a new downtown near my neighborhood? And we went, oh, wow, people don't realize that we're also talking about this. This is really what we're talking about. This, sure, that's walkable, but that's not what we're talking about. Missing middle housing is part and parcel of places to walk to, and not just the nature or the golf course, but these pre-World War II neighborhoods that we observed that in many, many communities are some of the most valuable neighborhoods. I don't know what the situation is here, but in most communities where these pre-World War II neighborhoods exist, that's where the high value real estate. I'm not saying it's the only location, but it tends to be pretty valuable because it's just in short supply. So how it works is that you see the blue little bars on the aerial map. Those are 2 blocks of a really beautiful area in Southern California called San Marino. It's where they get the Rose Queen for the Rose Parade, if you watch that. But I pointed out, there's a lot of other examples, but the reason I point this out is that little Main Street, these are people that could afford to tear it down and say, we're going to leave it vacant because we're so wealthy. But they don't, because why? It's an amenity. They can walk from their house to that thing. Yeah, they probably have jobs somewhere else. They go to downtown Los Angeles. The idea is that thing is an amenity. So this concept of missing middle housing over and over and over, we ran into this pattern of basically single-family neighborhood scale in terms of height and footprint, and we'll talk more about that. But that's the context, right? But always, there was either some version of like a 2-block Main Street, a 1-block Main Street, a corner store or 2 corners or a crossroads. There was always something other than houses, and that amenity was where those houses were centered around. And the constant thing was that the neighborhood was a mix of single-family houses and then other things. But they were all the scale of single-family houses. That's critical. So we also realized that there are really only 3 choices, when you boil it down, 3 choices being provided in the market. And people will say there are all kinds of good reasons for that. We're not debating that. We're just saying that the choices tend to be single-family attached or detached and big apartments. And big apartments can mean anything from 3 stories to as many stories as you want to say. The demand for missing middle housing, according to, you look up John Hunt out of Atlanta. He's a demographer and statistician that works for the home building industry, and we've actually talked with him, and he promotes this, and so we just started incorporating his research right into our presentations. But the general thing is that about 1/3 of empty nesters or boomers, and I'm in that group right now. I just turned 60. The third of us, according to the national statistics, are looking for this kind of neighborhood, and 2/3 of millennials are looking for this kind of neighborhood. Not everyone, right? But those are pretty big numbers across the country. Other interesting facts, and you can see all the sources here. I won't spend time going over that just to save time. According to this source, 1/3 of households are single-person households. And the point that John makes here when he presents his statistics is that most of what we're building is as if it were for different people, and often there's the 1/3 of market out there nationally that has different needs. According to this source, it's the AARP, 1 in 3 Americans is 50 or older. I'm definitely in that group, so I speaking from experience. And in the other one on the right there, I won't talk about it. I just want to take the time to say that increasingly AARP is looking at missing middle housing to help communities broaden their housing choices for people that want to retire, people that want to age in place. I was just in Westerville, Ohio. They hired us to go in there and work with AARP and figure out ways that they could realistically look at their community and say, where should this go and what changes do we need to make because we want to offer these choices. They're calling it aging in place. Their initiative through AARP is called Aging in Place. So just to say this missing middle housing idea is big with AARP already. And then according to this source, 10,000 baby boomers retire every day over the next 15 years, and half of them don't have any retirement. And according to this source, there's nowhere to live on the amount that they're talking about that they will have. And lastly, that should be a 15, I don't know what happened there, wow. 15 million households devote more than half their income to monthly rent. So those are general statistics for the nation. I don't know what they are here, but that's what we run into across the country. This other trend is happening too. Walkable cities are thriving. On the left-hand side, we spent most of the 20th century basically leaving cities and leaving those centers, right? Everybody can talk about the hotel or the cool building in downtown, in any downtown that you can think of, that was decrepit and they were thinking about tearing it down, and now it's beautiful. I mean, I heard that's what happened with the Tiger. I'm staying in the Tiger and I heard that story. And it's all across the country. So we spent most of the 20th century leaving these places, and the 21st century, we're running right back into them for a lot of reasons. One of the big ones is this demand that we've just been talking about. So what's missing middle housing? I want to say, if you take anything away tonight, it is not the new way to do medium density housing out in the middle of nowhere. I really hope that you take that away, that this is part and parcel of walkable places, and walkable places include something other than houses. But let me just say before we go further, it doesn't mean that if you're the home builder, you have to build a commercial center. It means that you should be looking for, like if this is a center, it means that the walking radius around that center, and the center doesn't have to be a circle, right? But that center area, the 5 to 10 minute walking radius around that amenity is where you start looking to do missing middle housing. Does it work everywhere? No. Some places won't want it, some places can't support it, but those are the places, not way down the freeway where you got the cheap land and somebody said, well, let's try this out. So again, there's the missing middle, right? It's everything between housing, single-family houses and big apartments. And we'll go through each of the types, but there's a palette of types. And this is really important to know, that it's not just more housing. It's actually physical objects like a duplex that you probably are aware of, but there's a lot of nuances to each of these types, like a 4-plex, a 6-plex, a 12-plex. There are nuances to their size and their form and how they fit on a lot and how wide of a lot they really need. All those things work backwards into actually fitting well in a neighborhood. Otherwise, you're just doing more apartments and people say, I don't want that near me. Everybody knows that drill, right? So we were sitting around the table about a year ago after we've done a lot of work on this, and we kept realizing that none of the 3 or 4 of us that do these talks or do this kind of work in the office were saying succinctly the same way what this is. So we got together and figured out, well, how can we succinctly say this? And this is what we say. So when somebody asks you, hey, what was that missing middle housing about? This statement: house scale buildings with multiple units in walkable neighborhoods. It's that simple. If one of those 3 isn't present in what you're talking about, it's not wrong, it's just not this. And I want to make that very clear, because if something gets promoted, it obviously, it's like somebody gets the new way to do the iPhone, now it folds in half, right? As soon as the other makers figure that out, they'll all be folding in half, right? So somebody's going to start using this, and we just want to make sure that everybody understands the intent of it and what it really is meant to do and not do. So let's go through the palette here. First, and I'm going to go through these because it's not enough just to put them on a wall and say, oh, they're up there. I think that's exactly the problem. So I want to go through these. First one is a carriage house, or more importantly, the ADU, accessory dwelling unit. So this one happens to be on top of a garage, but it could easily be next to it. It could easily be attached to the main house. It could be sitting in the back. An accessory dwelling unit means it's secondary to the main house on the lot. So it's not equal in size. It's usually smaller, and that is key. Remember, everything that we're talking about is working in a single-family neighborhood context. So why is all this important? Because size and scale and height and footprint and perceived scale and all that is super important to the neighbors that you're going to be working next to, right? If an area of single-family housing is going to receive investment like this, it's got to be done really, really carefully. Not that you wouldn't, but some cities just allow, more choices. Well, you've got to really figure out the sizes of these buildings and find out what works and what doesn't. So everything I'm telling you ends up going into standards that are really pretty carefully prepared for all these different types. You can't just say, oh yeah, let missing middle housing come into our neighborhood and then have one general standard or two. You need standards for each one of these things because they're all different. Duplex side by side. This is one that really gets, I'm going to use the word distorted. It's probably better than what I was thinking. It's the duplex side by side. Remember, look at that. It's a house scale, right? The width of that looks like one house until you look closer and you see two doors. And I've seen some here in town, and some are in good condition, some are in need of a repair. But critical to each one of these that I'm going to show you is you got to see the front door. It's got to feel like a house. And the windows have to look like a house, not like something that got put up and the windows are somewhere else and they comply with the building code. You drive by and until you see the second door, it looks like a house. All these little subtle things are critical, or else people say, you're just shoving another building with more people in it next to my single family house. And they're going to be right. On the top right, I don't know if I have a pointer here. You see the top right, there's a number, and on the bottom there's a little table. So you'll get a copy of this, and that's for you to look at later in detail. But on the bottom right is actually the lot size, the lot width, and the lot depth of everything I'm showing you. And it tells you the density. So I don't know if you use residential density here in Columbia. Most cities do. If you don't, you probably use some form of lot area per square foot of lot area per every unit you want to put on the lot. So for example, if you have a 7,000 square foot lot and the zoning code says you need every unit that you want, you need 3,500 square feet, and then you get a unit on it, and then we'll give you two, right? That's how that works. Well, that's density too. It's just phrased in a different way. So that word density you're going to hear me talk about a lot tonight, that's what I'm talking about. It's your square feet of lot area per allowed unit. Well, this calculates out to 20. And just keep in mind, these, you can say 20, wow, our zoning code, I don't even know if it allows that. The point is that all these examples I'm showing you were built pre-density regulations. Nobody went into these places in the 20s and 30s and said, oh, how many units are you allowed? 20. No, because you're going to see some weird numbers like 29. The reason those numbers are the way they are is because that's the math. That's what that lot is. And so you'll see on some of these that I show you, the top of, you see this little table on the bottom, the top row of that table is that lot. And the bottom row is an option. Like what if you increase the lot width or the lot depth or change the number of units? What would the density turn into? It's all math. 13 per acre. This one. This is a stacked duplex. So the first one was side by side, right? And you're familiar with that one. Then there's this one, stacked. And those are flats. The side by side can be two-story units. The stacked is obviously two flats, right? And the beauty of this is it can go on narrower lots. So if you are trying to be a little frugal with your lots, and this happens, it has a little side drive for the car. If you want to be a little frugal with your lots, and you want to use only, say, a 40 or a 45-foot lot, then the stack will work. The cottage court. I looked here. I couldn't find one, but you probably have one. Does anybody know? No? Okay. So the cottage court, and there's a little diagram on the right. The other ones don't have a diagram because it's pretty obvious, but this one, it isn't. The cottage court, or the bungalow court, is basically a garden in the middle, And there are little individual, like one-bedroom cottages around it, usually 5, 6, sometimes as many as 9. And often the unit in the back is the taller one. It can be a 2-story usually. But these are great because, at least in Los Angeles, they were workforce housing for the studios in the teens and the 20s. People came from other areas of the country and they didn't have a lot, they couldn't afford a lot, so the studio realized that. And at the time, I don't know precisely why they weren't building bigger buildings, but they did this all over the place. So if you go find where the studios are, these things are all down the side streets everywhere. And they're really, they've stood the test of time. They're really beautiful, they're highly valued. But more importantly, they're a housing choice at a small scale. So it's a 600, 800 square foot, maybe 1,000. Here's another version, it's a little bigger. And here's another one that's even a little bigger. And I put the aerial up there so you can see it. And then the triplex or the triplex. I tend to say triplex because you hit a triple, you don't hit a triple. I don't know. I'm glad you laughed. A lot of times people just look at me like, man, that's pretty geeky, but you do. You hit a triple, right? You don't hit a triple. So it's a triplex. Anyway, but you look at it quickly and you say that's a house. These other ones I was showing you, they're all older. This is brand new in Daybreak, South Jordan, Utah. Brand new. I'd say 1.5 years, 2 years old. And the developer here is building a big, giant community from scratch outside of Salt Lake City. And they, intentionally, on purpose, are building these and a couple other choices to mix. And they went out of their way to make sure that this looked more like a single-family house than anything else. But look at the density, 22 to the acre. Yeah, is right. Most people, if you didn't show them this picture and you just had a hearing about what density to use, 22 would get thrown out pretty fast. I'm not saying it's easy to get this done. I'm saying it's easier and more clear when you actually use examples and sizes and you're speaking very articulately about what you're trying to propose. This is a 4-plex in Greenville, South Carolina. At first it looks like a house, right? It's wonderful, but it's 4 units. And it's on a street with 2 other duplexes and 1 12-plex on 3 blocks that are spread out. The rest of them are all houses. And it's a beautiful street. And you can see the density on this one's 25. This one is what we call a mansion. It's a type that begins at 5 units and goes maybe up to 10. This has 5 units in it. It looks like a single-family house, right? Is it distorted? Oh, that's just me because I'm at an angle. It's a 5-plex, a multiplex small or a mansion, and it's in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, in a beautiful neighborhood just outside of the downtown. This is also in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and this is 7 units. And I want to say, this isn't the front of a 200-foot long building. These buildings are like 65, 75 feet deep at the most. That's really, really important to keep in mind that the footprint of everything I'm showing you is no bigger than the footprint of the houses that they're next to. That's really critical. The second that you change that, the neighbors are going to be right. The neighbors are going to say, man, that's too big. They say too dense because they don't know how else to say it. They don't have these other tools. But they really mean it doesn't fit. And they would be right. Then you have townhouses or a single family attached, and we break it up into 2 versions so that you can actually you can be more surgical about where to use this one. In this case, this is the 3-story version, and we call it the large because it's 3 stories, and it could be a whole block face. But this is the one we spend more time with. This is 3 to 4 in a row, no more than 4, usually 3. And we call it the small, and it's usually 2 stories, as in this case. And then the courtyard. The courtyard, it's a U or it can be an L, different configurations depending on the context in the neighborhood. This one, there's a little mini story I want to tell you. This is in Santa Barbara, California, and where it's really tough to do anything. Well, California's tough to do anything at all anyway, but it's even tougher there. And so our office, Dan was leading this tour one day. We were working on a project there. And he asked, hey, can you take me to the kinds of buildings that you want to emulate in your new rules that we're writing for you for this area that we're working on? Let's talk about them. So they took him around, and they walked up to this one, and they said, we love this one. Do the rules like this. And he went around the back and checked the gas meters, and he said, you guys, this has 8 units in it, and it's way higher density than what you've been telling us you want to entertain. It's 28 to the acre. And they just went, whoa. It's interesting. They liked the form, and they knew the building because it's their neighborhood. It wasn't like they just got out there and they said, well, we don't know what it's like to be a neighbor to that. They actually pointed it out as something to emulate. But once they knew the number, they went, oh, well, wait a second. So it's interesting, right? And then lastly in the palette is the multiplex large. And this can be 2 stories, but sometimes it's 3. This is a version in South Carolina where this one has 6 units in it. And you'll see the lot size. Look at that, it's 70 by 110. So these aren't huge. See, that's the other thing to keep in mind. Every one of these lots that these buildings fit on is comparable in size to a single family lot. If you're doing things that are bigger than single family lots, it's not this, it's something else. And I just want to emphasize there that I wish we could take credit for what these people invented 100 years ago about how to do this. We can't. We're simply unearthing it and reorienting everyone to something that's already been done, something that's already been figured out. And what we do across the country is help cities rejigger their zoning codes or add a new page in there, whatever it takes to let what used to happen. And it goes hand in hand with the predictability, both for the private sector and for the neighbors. So please understand what I'm saying tonight is equal parts. It's not just, hey, how do we make the development process easier and more predictable? That's a huge item to fix. Equally important, if not more, is the neighbors that are going to receive that investment as a neighbor need to have predictability and clarity on what they're going to receive. You know, it just goes without saying. So where do you find it? One of the best examples that we found is in Louisville. I mean, it's everywhere. If you look at a place that has pre-World War II neighborhoods, you're going to find it. This is in Louisville, Kentucky. It's called St. James Court. Look it up. It is beautiful. There are 2-story mansions, 3-story mansions, like a 3-story single-family house. Just beautiful. Really strong property values. It's probably about 5 minutes from downtown by car. It's a couple neighborhoods away. But these street views, you can see that they're stately houses. And there's a single-family mansion that's 3 stories, and right next to it will be a 2-story 6-plex. Or a 2-story 8-plex with an attic occupied. All kinds of varieties. It's really varied. Really wonderful place. And the director of Louisville, when we were there for a conference, and we met her, and she said, let's get in my car right now. And it was probably about this time. And it was dark. She drove us around until about 11 o'clock at night. And we walked around, actually. We got there, and we got out, and she says, you got to see my neighborhood. It's exactly what you guys are talking about. And we walked around old Louisville until about 11 o'clock at night. Yeah, it was great. And then here's where I just was in Greenville, South Carolina. You know, what we pointed out to the community, obviously this neighborhood knew it, but we pointed out to the greater community that this street is a perfect example of what we're talking about. You'll see the labels on the left show 1. It literally says 1 unit, 2 units, or 4 units. The majority on that street are single-family houses. But, as I mentioned earlier, there's just peppered in around there these other types. And looking on the street, you can't tell which ones are the houses. Well, let me ask you, of the two pictures on the right there, which one has something that isn't a single-family house? The top or the bottom? The top is the single-family house, the bottom is that 4-plex I showed you, and the neighbor to that is a single-family house. So other examples, I'm just going to go through some cities across the country. I could show you 20, but I think I've picked out 4. Here's in Pasadena on the west. I'm trying to go across the country. This is in the west. There's a triplex again on the left, a fourplex on the bottom, and that cottage court on the top right. Here's in Idaho. There's a mansion that I showed you on the left. Townhouses up there. Everybody's pretty familiar with townhouses. And then this fourplex that looks like a single-family house on the bottom right. And then in Greenville, we just talked about that. And so the next thing is to talk about, well, how do you find this in reality? Like what patterns are out there? And then if you want to recreate that, what are those patterns? There's certainly a lot of other approaches that you could use, but the patterns that we found over and over and over are these. Well, I'm going to show you 4. One is to, as I just showed you in that Greenville example, to distribute it throughout the neighborhood. And that would mean you would allow, you wouldn't require, you would allow these types through the zoning code to be built in a neighborhood. Of course, that short statement is probably a 2-year or a year process in actually figuring out what would be allowed, how big it would be allowed, and when, and all that kind of thing. So I don't want to, I'm not trying to simplify that or put it down. I'm just talking about the approaches. The next one is, you know what? The single-family neighborhood is very, very uptight about any change, and maybe they will accept some accessory dwelling units in the back or in the backyard, but that's it. And where they really will accept the changes on that corridor, that busy street outside of the neighborhood that sort of is dying on the vine, that might be where we might look for some missing middle. So that's strategy 2. Strategy 3 is saying, well, you know, there's some bigger apartment buildings that aren't missing middle, that are already going to happen or already got built, and they're on that busy street. And now on the side street, if you come off that busy street with the big apartments and you come down the side street into the neighborhood, that first or second lot receives a lot of pressure to change into something else because it's right next to that bigger thing. And the people living in it say, man, I love living in my 1-story house, but now I'm next to that 4 or 5-story building and I don't like it anymore, I'm going to sell. So that lot becomes vulnerable to change. And people don't think it is, but it happens. So you write standards to say, those first 2 lots, maybe just that first lot, when you come in off the return off that big street onto the side street, that's where you could allow missing middle, only there. And the last one is a similar version using a main street. You know, maybe you're a side street to maybe it's not a main street like this, but it's basically a commercial street. So what are the important characteristics of this? And this is, well, I've said it. It's all critical because you're not just putting these things out in the middle of nowhere. It's like this empty space right here. There's one right there. Everybody's sitting around this, and there's a scale, and you feel a certain comfort. And all of a sudden, if I came in here and started doing the wrong thing, you'd say, you don't fit. It's the same thing with buildings. And even though it's dying on the vine right now, the policy direction in the comp plan says that should be an important center to get reinvested in, and that's going to stay commercial. And it's the intent is for that to be better than it is. Then you can put missing middle housing there, and so you don't have to do both. You just have to have both, if that makes sense. So this map, and I invite you to talk to Greenville, either the city or the county, whoever you want to talk to. We just completed this work for them, and it basically tells them exactly where they should be looking at it. And we gave them a lot of information, but this map is really important because you see, yeah, I can point. You see in the middle of all these circles, there's some type of black line outline, like this is downtown. But all these other ones, there's some type of little outline with a black line. That's that center. Some of them are a crossroads, some are a couple corners, some of them are a 2-block main street. Those are the amenities. And so we said, should you be looking here to do missing middle? We don't recommend it because it's going to sit there and people are going to say, wait, I thought there was something to walk to. Now you're causing all this traffic. Exactly. Should we look at it in here? Yeah. So what this map shows is the underlying zoning, and those zones and the parcels popped up, and we focused on testing those. How far is a circle? You know, some people are stuck on the 5-minute, 1,250 or 1,300-foot radius. We went to 10 minutes because we talked with the city and the county, and they said, you know, yeah, it's hot here sometimes, and we get some cold weather, but let's not just be so doctrinaire about the 5 minutes, and let's go out to 10. So these radii show 10. Secondly, the important characteristic is that millennials and boomers want this, and like I said, AARP has noticed this. I'll tell you, my wife and I have a single-family house that we really like. We've been in it for 24 years. Our daughter is a grad student in her first of 3 years, and she probably won't be coming back to take it from us if we gave it to her. She says, I want to live near the action, like all the millennials, right? And it's a funny thing, we're saying the same thing. We're saying, this is a cool house, we love it, it's beautiful, but man, I want to walk down to that jazz club. I don't want to drive half an hour to get there. I want to walk a couple blocks. And I'm not saying every center is going to have a jazz club. I'm saying I want to do that. And then it's got to look like a house, not in its architecture. I want to be very clear here. Anybody can put siding and pitch roofs on a big building, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking back again about this width by depth. The height, obviously, right? But it's the width by depth. Again, if you take something away, house scale. What does house scale mean? It's different in every town, but usually what you do is you find the biggest house, and they're usually the oldest ones. You find the biggest house that you want to emulate in your new standards, and you find the smallest one, the cottage, and that's your range for house scale. It doesn't mean the biggest multifamily apartment building, it means the biggest house. Like the fraternity houses, those are pretty big houses you would call big mansions. That could be at the top end of your scale in terms of size. I'm not talking about, I also want to say, I am not here to promote doing dormitories or fraternity houses, even though I was in a fraternity. That's what I'm doing. I'm talking about house scale buildings. The other characteristic is that the units range, and they tend to have a range that the range is shifted toward the lower end, below 1,000. So that's why you see at the bottom of this, I know the top says units below 1,000, but there's a bottom line there. It says a mix of unit sizes. So I'm going to show you a project in a little bit where we did in Nebraska, where we mixed them, and they're from 600 to, I want to say, 1,800, 2,000. So they're, they can go across the spectrum, but you want to try and hit that 1,000 square foot average and even try to shift it below that. The problem is with density-based regulations, if you only get a certain number of units because of the rules, which are well intended, I'm not putting them down, but they're not realistic in terms of this. They're really not when you think about it. What happens is if you are only getting a few number of units, you're going to build them as big as you can because you want to get as much as you can back. But if you're allowed to put more units in there, then maybe you won't do it, but you have a little more reason to make a mix of the unit sizes, and that goes directly to affordability and housing choice, which is one of the things that Missing Middle does. Another, and this is probably one where I'll just say it's been nice talking to you. You'll probably ask me to leave because it's parking. Parking is tough everywhere. I've never been in a community where people say, "Oh yeah, we'll change our parking standards." It always comes down to parking in the end. Everything. I tell my wife, she's an architect, and I say, parking is like the drain sink. Everything ends there. Every discussion. It all just, right? So we're still laughing. Good. So the message on parking is that Fregonese Associates, they're a group out of San Francisco. They do a lot of demographics and statistics on urban places, regions, and so they gave us this information when we were doing some code work across the country, and this is really interesting. They noticed that on a typical lot like this that we're talking about, as you add one space, so here's one space, this is what it does to affordability, and if you add that second one, it actually increases it by 15,000, or basically in this case, 50%. Of the required income. So really parking, and these numbers you could debate them and how many spaces, but the issue is parking spaces as a minimum always affect affordability, and so everybody knows that, but the reason for bringing it up is that in missing middle housing, because of its proximity to those centers and the walkable amenity, we always advocate and write in standards less parking required than for suburban approach. If you put these things out in the suburbs and way far away from everything, yeah, they're going to need 2.5 spaces per unit. But if you put them in these areas where we're talking about, you can actually get to 1. Okay, you didn't throw me out. Okay, good. The other characteristic is that there's simple construction. They're like building a house. You're not building a big complicated building. You're building basically a house structure. And then this is a good time to point out that these types that we're talking about that we've observed all over the place, you know, it wasn't somebody came in and said, you know, I have a big house, I'm going to cut it up into 6 units and put walls in. That's not what happened. When they built these, they were intentionally built as units. And some had kitchenettes, and maybe if there were just a couple units, they had a kitchen. But they're not just cut up rooms. I want to be very clear about that. We're not talking about getting a house, let's say this was the house, and we just put walls up, and it's just a rabbit warren in there with doors. That's not at all. And then the project or the neighborhood becomes, we found that the diversity of people that buy these, the millennials and the older people, really add to the richness of the neighborhood. And often the very types themselves have some type of open space in them that adds to that as well. So barriers, a couple more sections here. The barriers are, again, I'm talking about nationally and our work, our recent work. I have not looked at your zoning code. I have not looked at your comp plan. I don't know anything about that, so I'm not speaking about yours, okay? The barriers that we find are this thing about, again, density, and if you use the other way, lot area per unit, that can result in unintended consequences. The people that write these rules never said, geez, let's get a building like this. Nobody did that, right? But what happens is the math on the properties isn't always figured out ahead of time, and nobody says, I shouldn't say nobody. It's rare for somebody to look at parcels that the zoning is applied to and say, wow, I wonder how many units that would result in, and wow, I wonder what size of building that would result in, or types of buildings. And I wonder if those buildings would make good neighbors to the things that already exist there. That usually doesn't happen. And so this is a result of a yield. Somebody said, hey, I'm sorry, but the density says, the zoning says I'm allowed X number of units, and I'm going to achieve that. How many times have you heard that? And, you know, I tell young architects in the office, because they say, yeah, and I said, well, wait, turn it around, and you're the property owner now. Don't you want to achieve everything you can? Why would you not? You would be, I mean, you might be altruistic, and that would be great, but it's our nature to say, man, they told me I could get 12. I don't know that I shouldn't get 12. Let me try for 12 units, right? So, yeah. I just want to say that because a lot of times, people who are pursuing the most are you know, cast as something not good. So let me ask you, I love to ask people this, what do these two buildings have in common? Don't think about it long, just
They have the same number of units.
same number of units? No.
The same height.
Same height? No. One's 3 stories and one's 2 stories. One more.
Same owner.
Same owner? No. What was over here? On the same street? No, they're different places. No, they're almost the same density. One is 3 stories on the left, and it is 175 feet long by 160 feet deep. The one on the right is 5 units, a mansion apartment, 40 feet wide by 55 feet deep, 65 feet deep. This one on the right is house scale. This is not. They're both good. They both have nice dwelling units in them, but are completely different. Yet this number doesn't really tell you the story. So if you were meeting and arguing about density or lot area per unit, it's the wrong argument to be having, or wrong discussion if you don't want to argue. But people usually argue about density. You want to be talking about building size and building footprint. And most of the time, like 80-90% of the time, people are talking about building height. Use lot area per unit. How limiting it is as a tool, I'm going to illustrate it here. This is that triplex that I showed you earlier, and here's the lot. It's 50 feet wide, and I don't remember the depth at the moment. I calculated it, and it comes out to 26 units per acre. It doesn't mean there are 26 units per acre on it. I mean 26 units on that lot. It means it calculates out to that intensity, okay? Again, you probably use lot area per unit if you don't use density. But that number is what people focus on. So just keep that in mind. Now, we're going to take that same lot that was over here at 26 of the acre, and I'm going to add 3 feet to it. So just think about that. From where my hand is to here, that's the physical difference. I'm adding that much width to the lot. But did this change? Not at all. But guess what? The density goes down by 7%, down to 24 to the acre. Does that feel better? It's the same thing. And this 3 feet of lot width is almost imperceivable. There could be a bush hiding it and you wouldn't even know it was wider. Then let's go the other way. Let's say we're going to reduce it. We're not going to add to it. We're going to take that 50-foot lot and we're going to cut it by 5 feet. So almost probably that wide. My feet spread apart. That wide. We're going to reduce it by that. Again, a couple bushes could hide that. And it goes up to 29 per acre. So the thing is, 26 goes up to 29. You increase the density by 12%. So if you had that conversation and said, hey, somebody wants to do this, but they want to increase the density by 12%. You say, no way, that's already too high. But if you have this conversation, you realize it's not changing the object at all. It's still a triplex. It's still the same building. It's just the lot width got a little wider. Do you see how unpredictable density or lot area per unit is as a tool? Yes, it's important. But it's more important as a projecting tool to say, hey, let's say this room was a region or an entire city or a county. It's important at that scale to say, wow, over that big of an area, if we make an assumption, what would we get? It's really useful to do that way. But when you get down to the lot, it doesn't make a lot of sense. You can make it make sense. You can reverse it and make it work for you, but people don't usually do that. Maybe your city does that already, I don't know. Another barrier is financing. Unfortunately, and I'm not an expert on this, but I know that once you get above, or you hit 5 units, the loans change. And I don't know about in Missouri, but in other states, the loans change from a residential loan to a commercial loan, and it's seen as something bigger than it really is, and so that's a deterrent. And so that needs to be addressed with your local bankers of why is that, and is there a way to allow 5 and 6 plexes in the same way that you would allow 4-plex. And then we've talked about the policy and regulations. Again, in Greenville, the latest example, we worked for a year there with them very closely with their city staff and the county staff to go through every page of their comp plan, all 20 of their area and master plans and their zoning code, and find out what's in here. And we produced tables and analysis that show this is a barrier, this is helpful, this is all that kind of stuff. So now they can just act on it. Also, the barrier is that this whole thing about single family and multifamily. People hear multifamily and they run, or they get mad because of all kinds of reasons, right? Well, it isn't one or the other. This thing called missing middle housing is really in between this. It's not what people think multifamily is, but it gets cast at that because the zoning code doesn't have the nuances in it, or the comp plan might not have the nuances in it. And again, it's not speaking ill of anybody or any document. It's just saying most people don't have that in there, right? This whole awareness that we're building is barely 10 years old, maybe 12 years old. So I don't know how old your documents are, but if they're older than that, it's likely they wouldn't have that nuance in there. And you need to put those nuances in there to give a policy direction that this is okay and where it's okay and how, and then your zoning code pick it up with the actual standards. And that's a nice segue to this. Obviously nobody would allow this. You guys wouldn't allow that building architecturally, and maybe you wouldn't allow the size of it. But this city, it's actually, I'm not going to tell you where it is. That doesn't work. I'm simply going to tell you that this city is a good city, let me tell you. They require, I don't know how this happened, but it happened. And look at the neighbor. This thing is not a house scale building. It's a great illustration of the need for house scale standards. They changed the density allowed in this neighborhood, without ever looking at the footprints of the buildings that these things were going to be next to. Maybe they thought all the buildings would change, but that's not reality unless there's a fire, and even then people will come back and build what they had a lot of times. So somebody changed the rules and didn't realize that some things were going to stay as you could realistically expect. And so you've got, this neighborhood is chock full of this kind of situation. And it's not even about the height, right? That's bad, but it's about these units in the back. Now they're looking into the backyard and going, hey, how's it going? What are you having for barbecue? It's just not, it's not a good situation. So who's building it? We found small and production builders, but mostly small. I think the biggest version is in Daybreak, Utah, by that developer in South Jordan. And this is a project we did in South Jordan for that developer. We call it a Muse unit. It's not one of the types that I showed you, but it's sort of a variation on the probably the Duplex or the Townhouse. And the units are turned sideways with their long side on this passageway. It's interesting because, yeah, they feel really big inside. They're like a loft unit. So they've got this double height living room, and then a living area, the living area here, and then a sleeping area upstairs. They're smaller units, and they really appealed to single moms. That was the predominant buyer of these units. And right here you can see the value, the price per square foot. And the developer told us that of their attached housing that they have in that entire development, this particular missing middle type had the highest per square foot return. Yeah, or sales price, sorry. And then this is a neighborhood that we designed and is under construction in Papillon, Nebraska. It's on 40 acres outside of Papillon there. And the developer, Jerry Reimer, he came to us after seeing Dan Perolic give a version of this talk, and he said, you know, I'm a multifamily developer, and I've been doing a lot of multifamily buildings all over the country. I've even rehabbed old, what you call missing middle types. I've actually rehabbed those inside those neighborhoods you're talking about, and I'm really into that. I don't want to do these multifamily buildings anymore. Other people can do them. I want to do this thing, but from scratch. So he got this 40-acre site, and we designed it, and you can see that it's blocks. And it's interesting. He said, people come here and they say, well, where are the apartments? Because they don't see the parking lots. And he's saying there are no parking lots. It's built like a neighborhood with garages or parking in the back or down the side, and it feels like a neighborhood of houses, even though they're not houses. No, nothing here is a single-family house. They're all duplexes, fourplexes, a couple triplexes, sixplexes. I think there's a 12 as well. And for the builders out there, well, even for the neighbors, you know, you have to be efficient. You can't be creating snowflakes or asking the developers to be creating snowflakes. There's a certain efficiency that is necessary. It's a reality. And so in this case, with 600 units, we developed several building types like the palette that I showed you, but on their footprint, they're going to be different, right? But to help the developer, we identified 6 floor plans that could actually be mixed and matched into 7 or 8 different configurations to give that building type the look and feel on the street. Meanwhile, the whole time, the developer's only using 6 different floor plans. You might say that's too many. Okay, but the point is, this guy wanted to narrow it down to 6. And you know, it's interesting, this guy also said, I don't want any corridor hallways. I want these things to really be like houses like they used to do. And the corridor hallways that I do in my big buildings, I don't want that. It's 15% wasted space. You may not agree with that, but that's what he said. And these are first couple buildings that are getting built. They're all 2 stories with an occupied attic. So what can you do to enable missing middle? You know, I'll let you read this list instead of me talking to you for the next couple of minutes. So just take a minute here and let you read it, and then I'll come back. I'll take a drink of water. Okay? Okay. So there's a lot of practical advice here about what to do, and maybe some of it you've already done. But the last one, oh, sorry. The last one, oh man, come on, is number 11, the pilot project. That's really, everywhere we go and we talk about this, and when people get excited about it, it's really one of the best ways to implement this. Before you start making changes and all this stuff that needs to get momentum, we found that a pilot project can actually get you that momentum. Work with a builder that wants to try this out, or builders, plural. Find a site that has all the right things going for it to be your first one, and then do it there. And work carefully, knowing that what you're going to do is going to be either the failure or the success of this approach. And so there's got to be a lot of give and take, and it's not about relaxing the standards. It's about saying there aren't any standards. We're going to make them from this. That's the way to look at it. And when you do that, in Northwest is where we've seen it several times. They've done these pilot projects with a very carefully crafted first project, and people say, wow, that's what you want to do? Yeah, okay, I thought you meant this other thing. This is great, we want more of that. And that's what the pilot project can do. So it's very important to draw a distinction between relaxing the current standards and just saying, no, let's not put that pressure on this project. Let's know that we're probably going to make adjustments or new standards. Maybe you don't have to change all your standards, but you're going to use this project to basically reverse engineer it and say, now that we know what this is, now let's go to our existing standards and ask questions, what needs to change? And if nothing needs to change, great. But usually there's something. The last couple of examples here of things to do. This is a project we did in South Bend, Indiana, and what this is about studying all the lots in that place and figuring out which of these building types fit on them. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of doing this. Too often, this is not done, and some abstract way of density or height is the only thing that's done, or people say, well, we'll review it and we'll know it when we see it. And that's a pretty risky way to do it in our experience. What you want to do, you have maps, especially now with GIS, it's even easier. You find out the prevalent parcel sizes. Are they 40 by 110s, 50 by 120s, 60 by 140s? What are they? And then you take these building types and you get information, you find out, well, what are their footprints and what lot widths do they work on? And you're going to find out, wow, the stacked duplex works on all these lots, the side-by-side doesn't work on these lots, and so on. And you just start figuring that out, and you can start to make, you can start to realize where they fit and what type of standards they need to support that. Lastly, just a little bit about the work that we did in Greenville. I want to give you a little quick overview of the scan and the deep dive. So we first identified where they had missing middle in Greenville, and we took that apart and said, well, what are the characteristics of the types you have? How big are they? And then we mapped their centers, as I talked about, in the zones. And then we looked for all the barriers. So the green are go, good, and the red are it's a barrier, it's not letting this happen. And they didn't even know that they have these barriers because they haven't tried to make it happen. So this is in advance of wanting to make it happen. And then we did a deep dive, took that information, and then took their zoning district and said, well, we got to look at their RMA zone district. A lot of this land that came up on that map of the centers and that walking radius is in this zoning district. There's a lot of them, but this is an example. So we took that RMA zone and applied it to the parcels and found the building envelope. So theoretically, this is what you could get. And then on the left, after you apply all the standards, it's actually what you get. So then we said, well, let's try a third example. What missing middle types would fit on that same lot, regardless of the existing zoning? Let's just say that the mayor said, hey, we're going to try an example here. And so we gave exact dimensions of what that is. And in a lot of cases, most cases, the thing that would hold these new things from coming in is the residential density or the side setbacks. In one case, I won't show you a picture of it, because I don't want people to take a picture of it and have people make fun of them, but one of their zoning districts, which will remain unnamed, was really intended for big pieces of land, but it was mapped on existing lots that were infill lots, right, existing blocks. So when we applied that zone to those, like a 50-foot lot, a 50-foot lot could accommodate several missing middle types. When you applied that zoning district to those those lots, the 25-foot side setback rendered it useless. It's like nobody thought about that because they weren't even thinking that it was applied to that. Again, there's no malice there. It just there wasn't any coordination between, wow, the standards of that zoning district are really intended for big pieces of property, but by the way, it's mapped on a lot of existing property. So, you know, that's a quick run through of what missing middle is, what it isn't, how it works, and what it's intended to do. And I'm sure you have a million questions. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tony. I really appreciate your fabulous presentation.